For weeks I've been talking about the chaos unfolding in Washington, but as I've watched events develop, I've come to realize that the consequences stretch far beyond political noise or temporary dysfunction, because what's happening now is shaking the very foundation of how the world sees the United States, and it's creating an opening that our adversaries have been waiting for. I've spent my life studying systems, economic systems, market systems, business systems, and the one thing I know with certainty is that systems never exist in isolation. Everything is interconnected, and when the central node becomes unstable, every part of the global network begins to shift. For decades, the world has operated under the assumption that the United States is stable, predictable, and trustworthy, and this assumption has not only shaped geopolitics, but also built the backbone of the global economy, especially the role of the US dollar as the dominant reserve currency. But now, for the first time in my lifetime, I see that trust eroding, not because of external attack, but because of internal chaos. And while we are consumed with political infighting, legal battles, and short-term victories that seem important in the moment, our adversaries are not only watching, but systematically exploiting every crack that appears in our foundation. China and Russia have taken two entirely different approaches, but the outcome they are driving toward is the same: weakening America's global influence, undermining confidence in the US dollar, and positioning themselves as alternatives in a world that no longer fully trusts Washington. China, for decades, focused on building wealth by manufacturing our goods and financing our deficits. But now that they have grown powerful, their strategy has evolved into something much more ambitious. They are presenting themselves as the new center of stability, the long-term partner that countries can rely on when America appears too unpredictable to trust. They are traveling across Asia, Africa, the Middle East, and Latin America, offering massive infrastructure deals, long-term trade agreements, loans in their own currency, and technology partnerships that bypass the traditional Western institutions, all while framing themselves as the calm, steady, and responsible leader in a world shaken by U.S. volatility. This approach is smart, patient, and highly effective because businesses and governments do not operate on emotion. They operate on predictability. If one partner becomes erratic while another offers 30 to 50-year commitments, most countries will eventually choose stability over ideology. And while China is positioning itself as the builder, Russia is positioning itself as the disruptor, and both strategies work hand in hand. Russia understands that its strength does not come from economic power, but from the ability to create instability, amplify division, and weaken the unity of the West. For decades, their biggest obstacle has been a united America aligned with NATO and trusted by global markets. But now they are watching us tear ourselves apart from the inside. They don't have to create the cracks anymore. We are creating them for them, and all they have to do is widen them. They invest heavily in information warfare, not to convince Americans of a specific ideology, but to make Americans distrust their own institutions and to deepen the polarization that already exists. Every time we turn our political battles into existential wars, every time we undermine our own agencies, every time our leaders attack the legitimacy of courts, elections, or regulatory systems, Russia wins because a deeply divided America becomes a weaker America, and a weaker America becomes a more predictable environment for Russia to pursue its goals without consequence. China, meanwhile, continues to build alternative systems, payment networks, trade routes, technology standards, energy partnerships, all designed to make the world less dependent on the United States. Combined, these two countries form a pincer movement. China builds the exit ramp from the US-led system, while Russia convinces the world that staying in the US-led system is dangerous and unstable. And the disturbing truth is that their strategy is working because the world is watching our internal chaos and coming to the conclusion that the United States may no longer be the reliable anchor it once was. For decades, our greatest strength has not been our military or our corporations, but our reputation for stability, rule of law, and long-term predictability. This trust is the reason the dollar has remained the global reserve currency, and it is the reason countries have been willing to lend us trillions of dollars by buying our bonds with confidence that America would always honor its obligations, regardless of political leadership. But now, that trust is slipping as global investors watch our political system grow increasingly chaotic and unpredictable. When the world begins to question America's reliability, they begin to diversify their reserves, and that means fewer dollars held abroad and fewer U.S. bonds being purchased. When demand for dollars and U.S. debt declines, the cost of borrowing rises, which means higher interest rates across the entire American economy. And that's not an abstract concept. That is something every family, every business, and every worker feels. Higher interest rates mean more expensive mortgages, costlier car loans, more expensive borrowing for businesses, slower investment, fewer expansions, and eventually fewer jobs. And this economic pressure doesn't happen in isolation because at the same time, trade wars, tariffs, and supply chain disruptions raise the cost of goods, creating inflation. When inflation rises while economic growth slows, it creates a nightmare scenario known as stagflation, where everything becomes more expensive while incomes stagnate and unemployment rises. This is the worst place an economy can be because the Federal Reserve loses its ability to help. Lowering interest rates would fuel inflation, while raising rates would stall the economy further. And as if that wasn't dangerous enough, this economic vulnerability gives our adversaries even more leverage because a weakened America has less power to enforce sanctions, less ability to shape global markets, and less influence over international institutions. Meanwhile, China continues forming decade-long commitments with our traditional allies, offering them certainty at a time when they feel uncertain about our direction. Our long-trusted partners, Europe, Japan, South Korea, have spent years relying on American leadership and stability, but even they now feel the need to diversify, not because they want to abandon the United States, but because our unpredictability forces them to protect themselves. They quietly build alternative systems, sign new trade deals, invest in other currencies, and strengthen their own regional alliances because in global politics, no partner can rely on instability. These changes are not temporary. Once countries invest billions in new systems that don't rely on the United States, those systems become permanent alternatives that reduce America's influence for decades. This is the true danger. Not that the world hates America, but that the world is adjusting to an America it no longer fully trusts. And while all of this unfolds globally, inside the United States, investors are becoming increasingly cautious because the risk of operating in a chaotic environment becomes impossible to price. As a long-term investor, I was always able to evaluate companies based on predictable systems, stable laws, consistent regulations, dependable currency strength. But now the system itself has become so unpredictable that even the best companies are harder to value. How can anyone project earnings 10 or 20 years into the future when no one knows what the rules will be in 6 months? How can businesses plan long-term when tariffs, policies, regulatory decisions, and political priorities change with the wind? This environment forces rational investors to move to cash, not because they want to sit on the sidelines, but because they have no way to calculate risk. The system itself, the very thing that made American capitalism strong, is losing stability. And our adversaries aren't causing this. They are simply exploiting the chaos we are creating. And this brings us to the most dangerous consequence of all. Because when the system that underpins your entire economic strength becomes unstable, every weakness becomes magnified, every risk becomes sharper, and every adversary becomes bolder. Not because they are suddenly stronger, but because you have made yourself weaker by damaging the very foundation that once made you unbeatable. The most frightening scenario is the currency trust crisis, because everything we rely on, our ability to borrow cheaply, to maintain low interest rates, to power our markets, to stabilize our economy, depends on the world's belief that the US dollar is safe, reliable, and predictable. But when chaos inside Washington shakes that belief, countries begin to sell small portions of their dollar reserves or shift to alternatives like the euro, the yuan, or gold, not out of hostility, but out of caution. And this is how currency spirals begin. One country sells a small amount, then another follows, then investors notice the trend, and soon the selling accelerates. Every sale weakens the dollar slightly, and every slight decline encourages more selling, creating a self-reinforcing feedback loop. At the same time, China accelerates the creation of alternative systems, digital payment networks, cross-border settlement tools, oil contracts priced in yuan, and long-term infrastructure loans requiring repayment in Chinese currency. each one reducing global dependence on the dollar. Russia, from the other side, spreads disinformation, rumors about instability in U.S. banks, whispers about government dysfunction, exaggerated claims of financial risk that don't even need to be true. They just need to be frightening enough for global investors to hesitate. And hesitation, in currency markets, is deadly. When foreign central banks, pension funds, and sovereign wealth funds begin to fear being the last ones holding a weakening dollar, they start to diversify faster. This is how financial panic works. It never starts with a crash. It starts with whispers, doubts, tiny cracks that grow into fractures. And once the fear spreads, it becomes impossible to stop without extreme, painful intervention. If the world were ever to panic and begin exiting the US dollar system aggressively, the consequences at home would be immediate and catastrophic. The price of imports would explode overnight. Fuel, medicine, electronics, cars, food. Everything would become drastically more expensive because the dollar would buy less on global markets. Inflation would surge at a pace that makes today's inflation look small. To stop this collapse, the Federal Reserve, which has already been weakened by political attacks and accusations, would be forced to raise interest rates to unheard-of emergency levels, not by small increments, but massive jumps, 5, 10, 20, whatever it takes to convince investors that holding dollars will be rewarded. But these emergency rate hikes would crush the domestic economy. No business could borrow. No homeowner could afford a mortgage. No market could function. It would trigger waves of bankruptcies, mass layoffs, housing collapses, and a rapid contraction of economic activity. It would be a second Great Depression triggered not by external invasion or natural disaster, but by the erosion of trust in our own institutions, amplified by foreign competitors who simply took advantage of our self-inflicted chaos. And while the U.S. is forced to choose between hyperinflation and depression, China and Russia don't have to fire a single shot. They simply watch as the United States, trapped by its own internal instability, pays the price of losing the very asset that made it the global economic superpower, trust in the system. Meanwhile, our allies would not be immune to this shift, because for decades their economic and security strategies have been built around the assumption of a stable, reliable America. But when a nation's closest friends start to fear its unpredictability, they quietly begin creating alternatives, and once those alternatives exist, they rarely disappear. Europe strengthens its own payment networks, increases trade with China, builds energy partnerships independent of U.S. influence. Japan increases its regional security arrangements and diversifies its currency reserves. Middle Eastern countries sign long-term energy deals with China and Russia, denominated not in dollars, but in yuan or rubles. These decisions, once made, last for decades because no country invests billions in alternative systems only to abandon them when the United States decides to become stable again. And this permanent shift means that even if America eventually regains its stability, the world will already have built a parallel system that weakens U.S. dominance permanently. This is the real danger, the one Washington refuses to acknowledge, that the consequences of our chaos do not disappear when the news cycle moves on. They compound, they multiply, they become structural. And once the global economic structure changes, America can no longer simply step back into its old role. It must compete in a world where trust is divided, alliances are diversified, and no nation is willing to depend on a single unpredictable superpower. This is why investors who have spent decades believing in the strength of American institutions are suddenly holding cash instead of buying the next great American company. Because all investing is based on one fundamental principle: you must be able to price risk. But how can you price risk when the system itself, laws, regulations, currency stability, political leadership, global alliances, is unpredictable? How can any investor confidently project future earnings when no one knows what the tariff policy will be 6 months from now, when regulatory agencies are used as political weapons, when alliances swing from hostile to friendly depending on who speaks at a rally, when the government itself is divided and fighting internal wars instead of protecting the long-term stability of the economy? Holding cash is not a betrayal of America. It is a rational response to an irrational environment. It is the only move that makes sense when the playing field itself is shaking. But the most tragic part of all this is that our adversaries are not defeating us. They are simply watching us defeat ourselves. China and Russia could never dismantle American dominance on their own. They don't have the power, the influence, or the economic strength to challenge the United States in a fair competition. But they don't need to. They have learned that the easiest way to beat America is to let America fight itself, to let America undermine its own institutions, attack its own agencies, divide its own citizens, and erode its own global credibility. They simply nudge, amplify, and capitalize on the chaos. And the leadership in Washington seems unable to understand that the world is not looking at our political drama the way we are. We see it as a cultural battle, a fight between Democrats and Republicans, a contest of personalities and scandals. But the rest of the world is looking at something else entirely. They are looking at bond yields, at credit default swaps, at foreign capital flows, at the number of trade agreements being signed without us, at the gradual shift from dollar-based contracts to alternative currencies. They are watching the scoreboard, not the spectacle. And the scoreboard tells a different story, that America is losing ground not because others are rising faster, but because we are stumbling harder. And the most painful irony is that the political leaders who claim to be fighting for America's survival are actually weakening America's position globally by making the system more unpredictable, the institutions less trusted, and the currency less stable. Every time they undermine the rule of law, every time they attack their own agencies, every time they turn governance into a personal battle for survival, they are making America less reliable, which is exactly what China and Russia want. And while those leaders celebrate surviving another scandal, another investigation, another news cycle, they fail to realize that they are winning tiny battles at home while losing the great global war for economic leadership. It is like a homeowner who prides himself on winning arguments with his neighbors while the foundation of his house is cracking beneath him, and he doesn't notice because he's too busy yelling at the fence. America's foundation, the trust of the world in our stability, is what made us the strongest nation on earth, and now that foundation is being chipped away every single day by internal chaos. And if it collapses, the entire structure collapses with it. This is why I fear what I fear. Not because I doubt the strength, creativity, or ingenuity of the American people, but because I see the system, the stable, predictable system that allowed all of that greatness to flourish, being systematically dismantled from within. And while our adversaries take advantage of every crack, the real threat is not them. The real threat is our chaos. Because a nation can survive external enemies, but it cannot survive losing the trust of the world. And if we lose that trust, if the dollar weakens beyond repair, if the global system moves on without us, then no election, no speech, no military parade will bring back the era of American dominance. It will be gone, not taken by force, but lost by neglect. That is the true cost of our chaos. That is the danger the world sees even if we do not. And that is why, until sanity returns and the system stabilizes, many of us must wait, hold cash, and hope that America remembers what made it strong in the first place. Not noise, not conflict, not personalities, but trust. And even as all of this unfolds on the global stage, the greatest tragedy is that the warnings are not being heard, not because they are unclear, but because the people who should be listening are too distracted by the noise they themselves are creating, and the institutions that once could rise above political storms are now being pulled into them. The courts, once respected as neutral arbiters, are now treated as battlegrounds. Regulatory agencies, once defined by competence and stability, are being accused of corruption or bias depending on who loses a case. Long-term policies that once lasted decades now flip every 4 years, leaving companies and allies unable to plan for the future. And when a country cannot plan for the future, the world cannot plan around it. And in a global economy built on interdependence, unpredictability is poison. Every investor, every CEO, and every finance minister knows that uncertainty is the enemy of growth, and uncertainty does not just slow a system, it corrodes it, weakens it, hollows it out from the inside. This is happening slowly, quietly, almost invisibly to those living inside the noise, but it is painfully obvious to those watching from outside. Investors abroad who once trusted America's predictability now hesitate before signing long-term agreements. Countries that once anchored their reserves to the dollar now diversify before markets open. Corporations that once built entire strategic plans around U.S. policy now include contingency models based on chaos. What most Americans do not realize is that a nation's strength is not built on speeches or slogans. It is built on trust, and trust is built on consistency. When the message from Washington changes daily, when allies are friends one week and targets the next, when treaties are questioned and commitments rewritten, the foundation of trust cracks. And once it cracks, it rarely returns to its original form. Meanwhile, China sees this as the opportunity of a century. They are traveling from region to region, Africa, the Middle East, Eastern Europe, Southeast Asia, presenting themselves as the predictable partner, the long-term builder, the country that can offer stability when America no longer seems capable of it. They sign 30-year energy deals, 50-year infrastructure projects, multi-decade technology partnerships. They offer financing that bypasses Western banks, and they do it with the calm confidence of a nation that has studied our weaknesses for decades. Russia, on the other hand, continues playing the role of the disruptor, using every opportunity to undermine Western unity. Their strategy is simple but devastating. Weaken NATO by fueling internal divisions, weaken Europe by exploiting energy dependencies, weaken the United States by amplifying political chaos. When they see Washington attacking its own institutions, they do not need to create propaganda. They simply repeat what American leaders are saying about their own government. And this is the most effective propaganda of all, not lies but amplifications of truths spoken by the system about itself. And while we argue internally, our allies grow anxious, and anxiety shapes behavior. European nations begin building their own defense strategies independent of U.S. leadership. Middle Eastern countries diversify their alliances toward China, Russia, and regional partners. Asian nations hedge by strengthening ties with the strongest neighbor in their region, even if that neighbor is also their biggest threat, because they cannot depend on an unpredictable superpower an ocean away. And here lies another dimension of the crisis. Once allies hedge, they rarely unhedge. Once they diversify, they rarely reconcentrate. These decisions become structural changes in global power. And this gradual shift, though quiet, is the most significant geopolitical transformation since World War II, happening not because America was defeated externally, but because America is paralyzing itself internally. Economically, the consequences are profound. For decades, American companies enjoyed a competitive advantage in global markets because they operated within a stable system. When an American company entered a foreign deal, it came with the implicit backing of the U.S. government, the strongest financial institutions, and the most trusted currency. But now, unpredictability undermines that advantage. When a CEO from an American firm tries to negotiate a 20-year contract and the foreign government asks, "Will the next U.S. administration cancel this?" the CEO cannot confidently say no. Meanwhile, the Chinese competitor can say, "Our policy does not change every 4 years, and we will honor this contract for decades." And to a country needing infrastructure, energy, or development, reliability is often more valuable than ideology. And so America, without realizing it, is losing not just contracts but influence, not just influence, but market leadership, not just market leadership, but the structural advantages that once protected it from economic decline. This is why investors who spent decades betting confidently on America are suddenly cautious. Why capital once flowing freely into U.S. markets is now looking elsewhere for safety or long-term returns. And while most Americans see stock market swings as political wins or losses, the rest of the world sees them as warning signs of instability. The truth is that America's strength was never rooted in political perfection, but in institutional resilience. The system was designed to outlast leaders, crises, scandals, and wars. But now, the system itself is being used as a weapon in political fights, and when political actors attack their own institutions to win domestic battles, they are unknowingly weakening America's global position. This creates a devastating cycle. Internal chaos weakens global trust. Weakened global trust weakens the dollar. Weakened dollar raises borrowing costs. Higher costs slow growth. Slow growth increases political anger. Political anger fuels more chaos, and the cycle repeats, each time weakening the system further. Meanwhile, China and Russia continue playing the long game. China is building influence not through force but through contracts, loans, construction, and technology. Russia is extending influence not through stability but through chaos, wars, disinformation, energy manipulation. Together, they are reshaping the world order, and America's distraction is their greatest asset. The scariest part is that China and Russia do not have to coordinate openly. Their strategies complement each other naturally. China creates the alternative systems. Russia pressures countries into using them by destabilizing the old system. China offers the new bank. Russia sets fire to the old one. China sells stability. Russia spreads instability. And America, instead of strengthening its system, is dismantling it from within, providing both adversaries with the exact conditions they need. And as all of this unfolds, the American public is kept focused on internal drama, legal battles, social media fights, and political drama that distracts from the quiet global shift happening beneath the surface. Most Americans do not see the trade agreements being signed without us, the dollar reserves being diversified, the energy deals bypassing American influence, the global payment systems replacing SWIFT in parts of the world. They do not see how global businesses are planning their future without assuming U.S. leadership. They do not see how credit agencies evaluate political risk. They do not see how central banks analyze instability. They do not see the numbers that truly matter, the ones that decide the future of global power. And this is the ultimate danger. A nation consumed by internal battles while its global position erodes silently. America is winning small, noisy fights at home while losing large, silent battles abroad. The silence is the danger. Silence is where history shifts. Silence is where empires decline. And if America continues down this path, the decline will not come from invasion or collapse, but from irrelevance. A world that no longer needs the US dollar is a world that no longer needs US leadership. A world that has alternatives is a world that can walk away. And a world that can walk away will eventually do so if the leading nation makes itself unreliable. And if that day comes, America will realize too late that global influence is not something you lose loudly. It is something you lose quietly, slowly, one contract, one alliance, one decision at a time. And by the time the noise at home stops, the silence abroad will reveal what was lost. This is the danger. This is the trajectory. And unless America restores stability, predictability, and trust, the world will not wait for it to get better. The world will simply move on.